Hi folks, Maurice Gleeson from ISOG here. In this video I've tried to reduce the background noise as much as possible, but you may need to adjust your volume in order to get the best effect.
Okay, well we're going to get on with the next talk for the day at the DNA workshop, sponsored by Family Tree DNA and manned by volunteers from ISOG like myself and everybody there on the ISOG stand behind us. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Graham Holton. Graham has, after long experience of being a librarian, he began teaching family history as a tutor of evening classes at the University of Strathclyde. And he's been a tutor on the university's postgraduate program in Genealogical Studies since it commenced in 2007 and is now Principal Tutor at Strathclyde. Now, until recently, Y-chromosome SNPs were regarded as only useful for ancient history, and this presentation will look at the increasing importance of SNPs for genealogy within the historical era, giving examples of branch markers which can now identify male line descendants of family lineages established between the 13th and the 16th centuries. So it sounds like it's going to be a real interesting talk. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome for Graham Holton.
Thank you very much. Can I just do a sound check? Is everybody hearing me okay? A bit louder? Yeah. How's that? Is that fine for sound? Yeah? Okay. Right, thank you very much, Maurice. So, as Maurice said, until a few years ago, Y-SNPs were only regarded as useful for discovering early ancestral origins, but the situation has now changed dramatically, and as my subtitle suggests, hierarchies of SNPs are now cascading down into the historical era. Hang on, sorry. The definition I'm using for historical era, by the way, is from about 1200 onwards, the point at which a considerable amount of documentary evidence is becoming available. So I want to look at four different aspects of these SNPs. First of all, what are they? Why are they important? What is their use in identifying branching of families? And where do we go next to make efficient use of Y-chromosome SNPs? So first of all, to explain what they actually are, this might be quite familiar to many of you already, but just run over this. We need to take a quick look at the science behind SNPs, or to give them their full name, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So here is an image of part of the Y chromosome, showing the four nucleotide bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And this next slide is aimed to show the difference between STRs, which you're probably more familiar with, and SNPs. So you see here, we've got male number 1, and we've got this motif here, GATA, which in male number 1 is repeated 8 times, male number 2, 9, and male number 3, 10 times, and the same for male number 4. Number 4, sorry. Those two 9 and that one 10, sorry. To the left of this, down here, you can see the SNP. And what's happened here is male number 1 has the nucleotide base T. At some point in time, that is changed to an A, and males 2, 3, and 4 carry the A version. And so, as a result, males 2, 3, and 4 are all descendants of the individual descended from male number 1 in which the polymorphism took place, the change from T to A. So why are SNPs important? A very significant feature of SNPs is the fact that they're much more stable than STRs. So once a SNP mutation has taken place, it's very unusual for a back mutation to occur. On the other hand, the number of repeats occurring in STRs can move up and down over a period of time. So we can have an instance where 8 repeats could, in a few generations, change to 9, and in another few generations, change back to 8. This can lead to the convergence or divergence of test results based on STRs. So I'm going to show you some examples to illustrate this, taken from the Battle of Bannockburn Family History Project, which we've been running at the University of Strathclyde since 2013. Just to explain very briefly what the project was all about, the aim was to look at the participants in the battle, which took place in 1314, and also the genealogy strand of the project was to attempt to use, to link up documented descendants of participants in the battle with other living individuals from today who have only very short documentation, but also to prove that they were descended from one of the participants in the battle. And we were successful in doing that, as you'll see. Okay, now, here we have a table here. You'll see in the middle here we have Earl Castle Stewart. He was the first documented individual that we tested in the project. He was descended from Walter Stewart, 6th High Steward of Scotland, who fought at the battle. Also tested, who had tested previously with family tree DNA, were Fred Stewart, you could see at the top there, and down here, Paul Thompson. It was clear from their test that they were both genetically Stewarts, despite the fact that there had obviously been a name change in the case of Paul Thompson. But what I want to point out here is the importance of the SNPs. So you'll see that in the second column here we have the Y-chromosome position. So that was at that position on the Y-chromosome, this SNP occurred. And Fred Stewart changed from a G to an A. And so he tested positive for the SNP, which was named S781. And we're going to talk a little bit more about S781 later. And that shows that he descended from the Bonkel line of the Stewarts. On the other hand, the Earl and Paul Thompson, their nucleotide base stayed the same at G. So they tested negative for this, 781 negative, which meant that they were descended from the line from James, 5th High Steward of Scotland. Now, the point about this is that the Earl had tested on 111 markers, so had Paul Thompson and Fred Stewart. And the prediction at around 95% probability from the STRs was for the time to most recent common ancestor between Paul Thompson and the Earl of 10 generations. Same prediction between Fred Stewart and the Earl was 12 generations. But the fact that they tested for the SNP 781, this showed and proved that the time to most recent common ancestor was actually 23 generations between Fred and the Earl. So because of convergence, the relationship between these two individuals, based on STRs, looked much closer than it actually was. And the result of this SNP test also meant that the time to most recent common ancestor between the Earl and Paul Thompson would be no more than 19 to 20 generations. And here you can see a picture of the Earl with the Stewart coat of arms there. Here we have Paul Thompson. Paul was an ex-London stockbroker. Now, the opposite situation occurred, and this is an example of divergence of STRs. And this was between Archie Shaw Stewart and the other testees on this table. So you can see Archie at the top here. Now you'll notice that he has, these are the genetic distances at the 37 marker test. You'll notice that Archie has 5 differences from a private testee. He had the documented lineage also back to Walter Stewart, who fought at the Battle of Bannockburn. Doesn't want to be named. So Archie had 5, a genetic distance of 5 from private testee, 6 from Donald Stewart, and as much as 8 from Earl Castle Stewart. So really considerable. And this, of course, meant that his genetic distance was out with the bounds laid down by family tree DNA for matches. So at 37 markers, only up to a genetic distance of 4 would in fact show up as matches. So Archie did not show up as a match to any of the other testees here. Now, subsequent SNP testing, along with the documentary evidence, has showed that Archie did share a common ancestor with Earl Castle Stewart and the private testee around 19 to 20 generations ago. But looking purely at the STR results, these would have suggested that that closeness of relationship was pretty unlikely. Right. So let's look at some other predictions based on our STR test results. FTDNA's TIP tool, Time Predictor tool, calculates the predicted number of generations to the most recent common ancestor between 2 particular individuals. And it takes into account different rates of mutation on different STR markers. Now, using that, we find that at around a 95% probability, between Earl Castle Stewart and private testee, the most recent common ancestors was predicted to be not more than 12 generations. Similarly, between Earl Castle Stewart and Donald Stewart, MRCA not more than 14 generations ago. But looking at the documentary evidence, we see that that was in fact 19 to 20 generations ago. Quite a considerable difference, as you can see. So the conclusion is that predictions based on STR results are unreliable, certainly for common ancestors as far back as 700 years ago. So I'd now like to focus on how SNP testing can be used to identify genetic branching in the historical era. And a few examples of this should give you an idea of what is now possible. I mentioned earlier SNP S781, so I just want to talk a bit more about the discovery of that at the moment. So it was early in 2014 that this very important SNP was discovered in the Stewart family. The Stewarts were High Stewards of Scotland and later Kings of Scotland. And this SNP S781 was identified as occurring in one particular named individual. Sir John Stewart of Bonkell here, who died in 1298 at the Battle of Falkirk. Now, descendants of, male line descendants of 2 of his sons, you see 2 sons here, Sir Alan Stewart and Sir James Stewart, male line descendants were tested and both carried the S781 SNP. You'll notice, in fact, that one of these was the current Duke of Buccleuch. Similarly, a descendant of Sir John Stewart's older brother, James Stewart, 5th High Steward, was tested and did not carry the S781 SNP. And so, the deduction was that S781 must have occurred in that specific individual, the named historical individual, John Stewart of Bonkell. It's quite rare at this stage to have a specific individual that we can pin down as being the origin of a SNP, and this is one that we have. But I'm sure it will become much more common as time goes on. So this slide shows some of the descendants from these major lines. So we have on the right-hand side here the Stewarts of Bonkell, there's Sir John there, all carrying the S781 SNP. So we've got down here Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, husband of Mary Queen of Scots, father of King James I of Scotland, 6th of Scotland, 1st of England. And there are, of course, other living Stewart descendants down there. And the other major branch coming from John's older brother, James 5th High Stewart, testing negative for S781. We have James's son Walter, who was the individual who took part in the Battle of Bannockburn, down to his son, King Robert II, and eventually down to Earl Castle Stewart and Paul Thompson that I mentioned earlier. None of these carry the S781 SNP. Now, for my second example, I'd like to take a look at the work of the Macdonald DNA project. This is one of the largest DNA surname projects, and it has over 2,000 members. Early work on the project established that the clan chiefs of the major branches of the family, so Sleat, Glengarry, Clanranald, and the current Lord Macdonald, all shared the same common ancestor. And you can see a gathering of some of these in the slide there. Now, this next image shows some of the various branches of the Macdonalds, which can now be identified by known SNPs. So on the right-hand side here, we have the Macdonalds of Glengarry and Clanranald, and they are marked out by the SNPs. You probably can't read that, but CLD12 and CLD33. And men who carry these particular SNPs are descended from Ranald Macdonald, first of Glengarry and Clanranald, who, if you can see that, died in 1389. SNP testing was carried out by a known descendant of the Kinlochmoidart branch of the family, a cadet of the Clanranald Macdonalds, which originated from John, son of Alan Macdonald, 9th of Clanranald, in the late 16th century. The test discovered a new branch marker for the Kinlochmoidart line called CLD51, which you can see here, and two testees down at the bottom. And here we have a Kinlochmoidart, known descendant from the Kinlochmoidart line. Now, Lee Macdonald, one of the participants in the Battle of Bannockburn Family History Project, also took the advanced test, and this discovered that he also carried the unique marker, the CLD51, for this Kinlochmoidart line. And so, this illustrates how, in the case of Clandonald, SNPs are now cascading down to the late 16th century. And here you can see pictures of current captain of Clanranald there, and on the right-hand side, an older picture of Lee Macdonald, who lives in Canada. Lee's earliest known ancestor was, using documentary evidence, was a Ward Macdonald, who was born around 1792 in Ireland. Ward emigrated to Canada, where he was a merchant, but nothing was known about his parents or likely siblings, or from which branch of Clandonald he descended. And now he knows from DNA testing that he's a close match to the current Macdonald of Clanranald on the left, who was a descendant of Angus Og of the Isles, another of the participants in the Battle of Bannockburn. And of course, he also knows from the further testing that he's descended from Alan Macdonald, in fact John, son of Alan Macdonald, 9th of Clanranald, who lived at the end of the 16th century. So a clear link has been made to a known historical figure living around 200 years before his earliest documented ancestor. And now we have an example from the Clan Irwin surname DNA study. Once again, we can see that the known SNPs have cascaded down to the 16th century. And on the left-hand side, we have Edward Irwin, who's confidently predicted as the originator of SNP BY3699. And then on the right-hand side, we have his brother, Black Christie Irwin, the originator of SNP BY3656. The Clanranald study has found that previous predictions based on STRs are proving to be unreliable, and as more individuals are undertaking advanced SNP testing, earlier predictions are having to be reviewed. Now, we're going to return to the Stewarts again now to look at some of the more recent research we've been doing from the Battle of Bannockburn Family History Project. Using the dual DNA documentary approach, we traced a documented male line descendant of King Robert III. So King Robert III over here, we tracked down Archie Shaw Stewart, who did a DNA test for us. He's a design engineer from Perthshire. And advanced DNA testing confirmed this descent and also resulted in the discovery of a distinct marker, ZZ52. Now, as you've heard, we'd previously tested Earl Castle Stewart, and you see here the number of generations back are indicated on each of these lines, and we'd also tested the private testy I mentioned earlier from this Butte line. So we had descendants from 3 of the sons of King Robert II, and from this it was possible to compare results, and 2 descendants of Robert III's brothers carried ZZ52 marker. This showed that ZZ52 had not been inherited from Robert II, the father of the 3 brothers. So it must have occurred either in Robert III himself or in one of his descendants. And so far, 5 other individuals have been found to carry ZZ52, one of them being Donald Stewart here, who still lives in Scotland. And Donald has a documented line back to the late 17th century. So he's now found that a gap of around 300 years has been bridged, and Donald has been provided with an identified ancestor, King Robert III, from almost 700 years ago. So, where do we go next to make the most and best use of SNPs? I believe it's important to make use of both STRs and SNP testing, particularly since at present STR testing is much less expensive, as you know, and more accessible to those testing for the first time. So a 37 marker test is very useful and effective as a verification test. And in many cases it can establish what surname matches a testee's genetic ancestry. Predictions of TMRCA within the last 500 years are probably a lot more reliable than for more distant timescales, since there's less time for the issues of convergence and divergence to have an influence. There are various tools which can be used for this purpose, which I'll talk about in a moment, but to effectively predict the TMRCA earlier than 500 years ago, SNP testing is essential. In this case, there are some SNP prediction tools which may give guidance on which SNPs to test for. So just very briefly, here are some of the methods which can be used to predict the TMRCA from STR test results. First of all, we have basic tables of time to most recent common ancestor. And these provide a very rough estimate of the number of generations to the most recent common ancestor at different levels of probability. But they don't take any account of the different mutation rates of different markers. Examples of 2 other tools are the Dean-McGee utility, and finally the TIP tool, which I mentioned earlier, which is only available to those who have tested with family tree DNA. Now, both of these tools do take account of varying mutation rates between different markers, but utility has not been updated recently, and the TIP tool, which is perhaps the most sophisticated general tool available, as I say, it's only available to make predictions between two individuals who have actually tested with family tree DNA. So, there are also problems with SNP testing, as I'm going to describe here. So next generation sequencing tests, such as Big Y from Family Tree DNA and Y Elite from Full Genomes Corporation, are expensive. So they're not likely to be attractive to a mass market. The best use at present is with long documented lineages, such as those that I've been talking about today that we used with the Battle of Bannockburn project. And in this case, the results can be used to form a reference sequence, a reference framework within which undocumented lines can be fitted. If there's a reference framework in place, SNP packs, which often test for around about 100 known SNPs, and also individual SNP tests, are good ways for individuals with short documented lineages to fit in and find a place within an established reference framework. In the same way that STRs have mutation rates, SNPs also have their own mutation rates. And these are important in dating the origins of SNPs, and have received a good deal of attention recently. There have been recent articles by Adamov and others, and also Trombetta and others. And they tend to focus, these were both published in 2015, and they tend to focus very much on early genetic origins rather than the historical era which most of us as genealogists are concerned with. So the mutation rates suggested by these and other studies are based on long time periods, so we're talking about thousands rather than hundreds of years here. And because the mutation rates tend to average out over longer periods of time, the suggested rates, I would suggest, are appropriate for calculations over long time periods, but not so much so for the historical era. It's becoming clear that mutation rates of SNPs vary in different parts of the chromosome, in different haplogroups, and in different periods of time. A further problem at present in dating SNPs, of course, is that, relatively speaking, there's still very few SNP test results available to base any calculations on. My conclusion is that the use of generalized averages to calculate SNP mutation rates may be unreliable in the period of interest to most genealogists. Calculations have been made for the historical era by organisations such as Y-Full, but I would suggest that there's a need for the development of bespoke utilities, following on from research into specific subclades, such as the work done on U106 by Dr. Ian Macdonald, which some of you may be aware of. In fact, it might be of interest for me to tell you that Dr. Ian Macdonald, who is actually around today, he's just recently been appointed as an honorary research fellow with the University of Strathclyde. So we're hoping that we'll be able to work profitably with him on developing some of these things. So I've showed you a number of examples from the Battle of Bannockburn Family History Project as illustrations. The next stage in the process will be to hopefully extend this project using the same methodology on a wider scale. And I would like to end my presentation with explaining the methodology for SNP discovery in the historical era. Firstly, I should point out the challenges involved. The extinction of male lines is very considerable over a long period of time. We found that from the Scots, we were able to establish 2 documented descents. out of 19 known names who took part in the battle. On the other hand, from the English, we're again able to establish 2 descents out of 139 known names. So it's quite an interesting fact in itself. Of course, this process was closely linked with the need for authentic documentation, and that adds to the problem, of course. Even once these issues have been overcome, there is the possibility that any potential testees identified may be unwilling to test. And this problem may be more acute following the outcome of the recent Pringle baronetcy case, which allowed the admission of DNA evidence in deciding the succession to the title. And clearly this poses a concern to those with titles and lands dependent on the inheritance. So the first step in the methodology itself would be to gather authenticated, documented genealogies from the pre-1600 period with living male line descendants. Due to the availability of sources, it's obviously going to tend to focus on the nobility, landed gentry and clan chiefs, but could include others if they have well-documented lines. Identified individuals would then be issued invitations to take a test, and this would be a basic 37 marker STR test for verification purposes. And this would verify by significant matching with others of the same surname that the documented descent is also the genetic descent. If the results are positive, further testing would be undertaken, particularly NGS tests and possibly individual SNP testing as well. And the aim would be to use the results from these documented lines to establish a reference framework which short documented lines could match against. The final stage would be to examine test results from short documented lineages with a minimum of 37 STR results and a TMRCA of 400 years or less. This would be to safeguard against the issues of convergence and divergence that I highlighted earlier. And the aim with these results would be to try and group them to identify those who would seem likely to match with the long, well-documented lineages that have already been established. And to aid in this process, it may be possible to use tools such as the RL21 SNP predictor tool developed by Robert Casey. Using SNPs established at the previous stage, selective testing of these individuals with individual SNP tests and SNP packs should begin to place the short documented lines into the framework created by the long documented lines. So to sum up, I hope I've managed to establish the following points. Firstly, the SNPs are very important in the effective use of genetic genealogy and should be given greater emphasis than STRs. Secondly, that SNPs have already been used to identify significant branching within families in the historical era. And finally, that a major area for the development of genetic genealogy should be the creation of a reference framework of SNP test results from long, well-documented lineages. So, thanks for your attention, and I'll attempt to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks very much, Graham. That's a great presentation. I think it's very interesting to see the work that you're doing, especially in Scotland, University of Strathclyde, with the Scottish genealogies, because the Scottish genealogies in many cases go back much further than the English genealogies, and certainly there's a long established culture of genealogy in Scotland, which is a prime source for doing these kind of DNA testing. I know that there's several people here in the audience that are actually associated with the University of Strathclyde, and I've used some of the techniques that you've outlined in your presentation in my own at least in DNA Project, building a descendancy tree based on SNPs, adding in the STRs at a later, more downstream part, and then, of course, hanging on people's individual genealogies as well. Unfortunately, the Gleasons did not go back to 1300. I think a lot of us probably don't have families that go back quite that far, but I think the methodology that you're using in these well-established families can just as easily be applied in some of the surname projects that we're doing today. Any particular questions for Graham? Well, there's a question back here.
I'm a member of the Z63 project, which is a subclade of I1. And Paul Stone and Chris Spain have prepared a very detailed analysis of those many of us who've done full Y-full testing. There's a significant number of members of the Hamilton family on that. And my particular question, it relates to the anticipated timescale of the SNP mutations, because the Hamilton project seems to suggest a longer time than is suggested by other members of the group. I wondered if you had come across anything similar in your project.
Right, well, this is quite interesting, and certainly families such as the Hamiltons are ones that we'd like to try and encompass if we do get the possibility to extend the work we're doing. It's a question of time and money, of course, but hopefully we will be able to. The particular issue of talking about, I can't say I've come across any specific examples of that, but it might be worth me having a chat with you afterwards, and we can maybe try and follow up and see if we can work on that at all.
Googling Z63, you will be able to get out, it's about 2 or 3 pages in, and you will see that the projected timescale of mutations on the Hamilton project is about 150 years, which accords with the Y-full generality. But for other groupings, it seems to be more like 100, just over 100 years, and it's a fairly significant discrepancy, and that's why as I'm affected by the ones that are in the 100 years, I'm interested to know what the implications might be.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of area that we might be trying to work with in conjunction with Dr. Ian Macdonald that I mentioned there. Since he's now been appointed as honorary fellow, he's very much into the science of things, the technical side of things. My own focus is more so on the methodologies and so on to apply, and linking up with the documentary evidence, but I think it's something we'll work on with him over the next year, probably. Yeah.
I think there are various estimates, like you said, there's various estimates for how many years per SNP mutation. And of course, it's going to be a lottery, because they're not going to happen every 150 years exactly. Some of them are going to happen to 70 years. Some of them might happen generation to generation, so it might be a 30-year gap. Others might not happen for several hundred years. So certainly I've come across, and I always take these estimates with a big, broad pinch of salt, if not a cake of salt, because the range on either side of the estimate is going to be quite large, as you've probably seen from Y-full. I think the current Y-full estimate, correct me if I'm wrong, John, is about 130 years per SNP mutation. 144 years per SNP mutation, which kind of accords with your 150 years. But then I've seen other people who have even gone down to 90 years per SNP mutation. And there's nothing to say that the SNP mutation rate you see in the Stewarts of Bonkle is going to be exactly the same as a lineage from Africa, for example. So, you know, different DNA from different parts of the country, from different families, may actually mutate at different rates. So that's why I think these estimates do have to be taken with a large pinch of salt. If it accords with what you have on documentary evidence, that's good, and it's very tempting to think it's supportive, but it may not necessarily be, because we don't actually know, because we're just giving an estimate and hoping that the estimate is relatively accurate. It will be in the ballpark figure, but statistics and genealogy are two very, very different things.
And I think this is one of the problems with trying to use sort of general utilities as well. I mean, they're really not very effective, and this is why I'm saying I think there's more need for bespoke utilities to be developed. And another issue, of course, might be the fact that haven't reached full genome testing yet. And perhaps there are SNPs every single generation if we test the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested because I've got an anonymous match which appears to suggest a common ancestor some way back. Paul Stone's estimated about 50 years ago. I'm inclined to put it rather higher because I think his estimates are probably rather low on the permutation. But as I say, I'm just interested to know. I'm well aware of the problems that Maurice has pointed out, and I take the same view myself. But I'm not an expert. But you can read if you read enough. You can pick things up, and that's what my conclusion. I just wondered if you'd come across a similar discrepancy in your studies. That was really what my point.
Yeah.
I think it's very important for all of us to remember that if you interrogate the statistics long enough, they will confess. So you have to be really, really careful about how we interpret these statistics. But I think, Graham, that the work that you're doing with these long pedigrees is going to be hugely informative of how we think about these things. We can also use the STRs, of course, for estimating that time to most recent common ancestor. But if you actually look at the range around STRs, they stretch into almost 1,000 years on either side of the 37 marker estimate. The range comes in a little bit more on the 67 marker estimate and on the 111 marker estimate even more. But I've gone up to using 495 STRs from Y-full, and what I found was the range came into approximately a third on one side, a third of the value on one side and a third of the value on the other side. So, for example, if the estimate was 600 years, then it would be minus 200 years on one side and plus 200 years on the other side. So you still have to be very, very careful, even with the STR estimates. And you'd probably have to go up to maybe 1,000 or 2,000 STRs. And I'm not even sure there's that many on the Y chromosome to really bring in those arms of the range into a range that would be genealogically relevant. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, here we go.
I have a comment and a question. One has to do with STR testing and a shocking result in my family. My mom had two brothers, and along the way I tested a son from each of the brothers. On the 111 STR test, they were 2 markers apart. These are first cousins. I was astonished. It really blew away any conceptions I had about genetic distance. Second thing is a question for Graham or for Maurice. When is it worthwhile to do not only a Y-full analysis of a big Y report, but also an FGC? Is that the name of the other company? Because I'm thinking, as I mentioned earlier, I've sponsored 5 big Y tests, which shows I'm completely crazy, but 1 brother and 4 cousins. And I'm thinking that for my cousin who's an RU109 and has the wonderful services of Ian Macdonald, Charles Moore, and others, that it's kind of a waste to go to FGC for them. But I'm thinking maybe my Horton brother and my Horton Yorkshire cousin, something like a 12th cousin of us, a third cousin who's an in-betweener went to FGC and got an additional SNP named. And so I'm thinking that's probably worthwhile for those 2 guys because it's not that much more expensive, right? Yeah, but anyway, that I'm just trying to figure out. I mean, Y-full was kind of easy. If you're going to buy a big Y, another $49 was not that much more. But when does it become ridiculous?
Well, Graham, you've had experience of Y-full and FGC and...
Well, I was just going to comment on the point you made about the cousins and the difference. I mean, I know there are examples of brothers who don't match, who are definitely shown to be brothers, but, it does happen.
And in fact, the frequently asked questions page on the Family Tree DNA websites does have a table for each of the marker levels, 37, 67, 111, and what does it mean if 2 men match at 0 out of 111, 1 out of 111, 2, 3, 4. They give a variety of different genetic distances, and if you're 0 out of 111, then there's a 50% chance that your first cousins are closer. So that would be brother, father, grandfather. But there's a 50% chance that you'll be more distant as well. And that also comes back to the problem of using STRs and genetic distance as a method of calculating time to most recent common ancestor. But 2 out of 111 for first cousins doesn't surprise me. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that much, you know, because we've seen it from father to son, that you can actually have a genetic distance from father to son and a genetic distance of 3 out of 37 between grandfather and grandson, you know. But to talk about FGC and Y full, I've done big Y with 10 of my Gleasons, and I've done a Y full on most of them as well, and it's been very, very useful for identifying those shared SNPs that they have, and also the private SNPs that each individual has, because Family Tree DNA's reporting system doesn't make it very easy to identify them. Family FGC I have not used, but Y-full, the job that Y-full does is also replicated by Alex Williamson on the Big Tree. So in many ways, when I've compared the results from Y-full with what Alex Williamson does in the Big Tree, there isn't a huge difference. There isn't a huge difference in my experience. There was previously, but there isn't maybe so much now. But you're in luck, because there's other people in the audience who have tested with FGC and Y-full, and I am going to pass the microphone to the people sitting behind you. We have John Cleary and we have Keith as well.
FGC does both testing and interpretation. So my understanding is that for a much smaller fee, I could submit my cousin or brother's data. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't comment on FGC's analysis. Keith can in a moment, but what I would say, I don't think what Alex Williamson does or what Y-full does is the same. I think they're a little bit different. I'd always say do both to anybody. Alex Williamson is a volunteer who's doing amazing work. He does it for free and for love. So just send your stuff to Alex Williamson and get yourself on the Big Tree. But consider doing Y-full as well. However, Y-full and FGC tend to have specialities in different haplogroups. So I do much work with R1A testers, and Y-full are the experts on that haplogroup. I would go to them first every time with an R1A kit. But with an R1B kit, FGC may actually know more about it. So I'm going to pass the camera to Keith. You might be able to comment on this.
My preference would be to use Y-full, but I think that very occasionally you get an extra SNP picked up by FGC in their analysis.
If I got that situation, I would then want to send the SNP to Y-full to ask them why they declined it. Y-full do decline a few SNPs in certain areas known as a centromere for very good reasons. And my sense, I could be wrong here, my sense is that FGC tend to name a few too many SNPs and maybe should decline a few, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, that's my sense. Yeah.
So there you have some hot off the press expert advice on FGC versus Y-full. I think for me, I think if you want the cheap option and you're in an R1B, then going to Alex Williamson is a pretty good thing, you know, especially if your project members don't particularly want to fork out an extra 50 quid. You know, we've already paid $575. Why should we pay another $50? So sending them to Alex is a good way to get that information, that additional analysis on your Big Y or FGC results. But of course, Alex only does R1B. So if you belong to haplogroup I, or haplogroup J or G or any other haplogroup, then Y-full or FGC interpretation would be necessary.
In fact, most of the men in my family are RM269, and I mentioned that in addition to these 5 big Y guys, I have 15 people in my family or my husband's family that are stuck at RM269. Some of them have matches, some of them have a match, 0 matches, etc. And you know, and I can't afford the Big Y, all of them. I know of 3 I will. Okay, but you're right. I, J, and then Q, a gentleman, an English Yorkshire man with the same surname as me, came back as Q. He was very surprised. We all were. And I don't know what to tell them to get more help. I just say, I don't know anything about I or J or Q. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I can't comment on the I's and J's, but you said you had a lot of people who are M269. and you can't afford to do big Ys for all of them. Well, you probably wouldn't need to, but what you can do is consider the M343 SNP pack, which is effectively the R1b base SNP pack, and that would take them down to their particular branch under whichever major section of M269 they're in. So you can consider that. It's much cheaper than doing big Y. You then do a selected big Y, so those would then look interesting after having done that.
And I just want to support what you're saying about Alec Williamson as well. He's done great work. We've worked with him on some of the Stewart stuff, and he identified the ZZ52 SNP for us. Yeah.
Okay. And Alex is working independently. He's a volunteer, and he's just taken on this work, as John has said, just for the love of actually trying to decipher the lower branches of the human tree of mankind. The other thing that you could do, apart from the backbone test, which is the M343, M269 test, is you can liaise closely with the haplogroup projects. And anybody who has done a Y-DNA test should join the relevant surname project, but also join the relevant haplogroup project, because the project administrators are a great source of support and information. And one of the things that they're able to do now, and you can do it yourself to a certain extent looking at your project members, and I mentioned this yesterday, is to actually look at the matches that each of these people have and look at the terminal SNPs that these people have. Now, it doesn't work in your case if they have no matches, because you've got nothing to compare them to. But if you have somebody who matches maybe a few people of the same surname, matches people even of different surnames, and there's a good 20 or so there at the 37 marker level, I go down to even 25 markers to look at how maybe 100 matches at the 25 marker level. But if you look at the terminal SNPs of their matches, and if they're all congregating on the same general downstream branch of the human evolutionary tree, then that would be with 99% probability, because I give myself a 1% get-out clause, 99% probable that they would also cluster on that same branch. Ask the haplogroup project administrators if they agree, and then you can skip the backbone test, which is fairly upstream, and come down to a more downstream SNP test further downstream. So that's something else you can do. Any more questions at all? Well, it's been a fabulous discussion, and I think, Graham, the work that you're doing there with the Scottish pedigrees and tying them into SNP testing and STR testing is incredible. Hopefully we'll get an update on the Stewarts of Bonkle and the Stewarts of the High Stewarts in due course.
Yeah.
But please can we show our appreciation for Graham Holton.
Okay.